What a woeful and miserable spectacle must we, the occupants of the barge, have presented the view of the lookers on. From either side of the river, some laying this way and some that, some sitting, some lounging in of any form to find small ease from their pain. Many of them exhibiting bandages like mine, of their stump legs, others with their bandaged arms, off by the shoulders, others of body wounds, having their coats slung by the neck, and again, others to whom the shot had no respect, with their faces or heads strapped and crossings with sticking plaster. This, I thought, must have been an appalling sight indeed. To the kind-hearted and sensitive Londoners, passing under London Bridge, the barge master told them to give 3 cheers. The men, all struck with amazement, turned their eyes to look, but their only response was a low, surly growl.
This was the account of Sergeant Jackson of the Coldstream Guards on his return to London in 1814. He had just lost a leg, and a hero's welcome he did not receive. This was a pattern to be sorrowfully repeated all across the nation, and once again in 1815, after Waterloo. The men and officers of Wellington's army, both in the Peninsula and Waterloo, were not to be remembered or cherished. The wounded would become ugly reminders of war, and unwelcome. The officers too, only years, months, weeks, or even days after leading their men to unimaginable victory, would suffer much the same fate, rotting away, abandoned and forgotten in gutters and taverns all across the cities of Europe. This is the world of Wellington's army after war's end. Hero worship of veterans, it's so ingrained into the collective consciousness of Western society. In the UK, the wearing of the poppy is almost cultish in its fanaticism. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, bells ring all across the nation to signify the collective respect of the nation for the men of the First World War and the Second. In the lead up, the infamous Tommy statues begin to pop up, memorials unveiled, and nearly every town in the UK, no matter how small, has a memorial for their lost and dead. But very little exists for those beforehand. When I was much younger, my favourite TV show was Sharp. For the uninitiated, it was an immensely popular British TV programme where Sean Bean gallivants across the peninsula and Waterloo, sleeping with every woman he finds, killing every Frenchman he sees, and duelling Daniel Craig, all while he wears a snappy 95th Rifles uniform. The show was aged when I watched it, and even more so now. It's almost comedic with its red paint for blood and cheap sets, but it did have some heartfelt moments. When Sharp inherits a flogged regiment and takes pity on them, he turned them into his loyal men, who fought and died beside or behind him. Or when Sharp's own merry crew of riflemen are killed and left to die in the mud of Quatre Bras in the final episode. But for the most part, the show is very light-hearted. Gallivanting and over-the-top heroics are the order of the day. And this, it's all we really have. For many, the perception they have of armies of the age is Sharp. And we have even less for the men of conflicts beforehand, like the Revolutionary Wars or the 7 Years' War. In fact, if anything is produced, it's an utter character assassination on the poor old redcoat. I'm looking at you, the Patriot. If you were to walk the streets of London today, it would at first glance seem like I'm wrong. It's a city that deceptively basks in the glories of these men. Nelson's column is obscenely large, trumping the size of Field Marshal Montgomery's statue 100 times over, sitting only a couple of paces away. Or Waterloo Station, which pays tribute in hundreds of small little ways, all in more than name to the fateful battle. Trafalgar Square, which needs no introduction to its namesake. But this is all a tragic deception, because these battles are a foundation of empire, much more so than the Somme or Dunkirk. In this, there's a hint of seeing but not acknowledging, hearing but not listening, because while Nelson, the hero he was, is immortalised 100 times over, his sailors are not, because unlike the Somme or Normandy or El Alamein, where the soldiers were remembered 1,000 times over, the public did not particularly care for Sergeant Jackson and his band of wounded men, or their tens of thousands of fellow soldiers. because they didn't care, we don't care. Every school child believes General Haig was a butcher who led lions to slaughter. Yet Wellington was a fine leader who led criminal scum to their deaths. And all the better for it. But just hold on a second, that did sound awfully harsh. If your gut reaction was, that's an unfair assessment of Haig, or perhaps I've treated Wellington much too harshly, you're definitely correct, but you're also part of the many others who have fallen victim to this phenomena. Yes, this is an unfair comparison of their leaders, but that is not the focus. The focus is on the brutal comparison of the men. Late Georgian and Victorian societies reached fanatical crescendos of hero worship. Quite a bit reminiscent of us today and the unnamed Tommies, but they were certainly not so keen on the poor old redcoats. I've taken part in countless remembrance ceremonies in the course of my life, but there was certainly something deeply wrong with the overt hero worship of the dead men of the great citizen armies of 1918 and 1945, when we contrast it with Sergeant Jackson's previous account. Now, this is not an attack on Remembrance Day or a denigration of the sacrifices of the millions, and it's far from it. But it's also not the topic of today, and as such, please forgive me if I make no more mention of them, because for once, it's not about them. Because lest we forget, is here contrasted with the harsh reality that we have forgotten. These men have hundreds of documentaries, thousands of books, and many countless YouTube videos written about them. Allow the men who lay rotting and dead in unmarked graves at Waterloo, Talavera, and Badajoz just one moment to remember what has been forgotten. So why can we not remember them? Why do we treat them as so far detached from the men only a century later? Many of the men of the First World War, I'd be willing to wager you, had great-grandfathers, or among the more aged men and officers, even grandfathers who fought at Waterloo and the Peninsula. They're not as different as we may like to think, yet in the public consciousness, they're nothing but scum. Where perhaps did we go so wrong? Well, the common answer is time. The men are gone. There's none left even who knew the men. But this answer has always seemed a little bit of a cop-out to me, an easy excuse for a tragic mistake. Because time certainly does not explain our old friend Sergeant Jackson and his treatment on return, or the treatment of all the veterans of Waterloo who came home whole, or perhaps a little less than whole. Earlier I slightly alluded to what the answer may be. The public simply just didn't like the army in the age of Wellington. The army was not what it has become today. Wellington himself referred to his army as the scum of the earth. And while this in more recent years has been blown out of proportion somewhat, as he was particularly sour in mood, his army had just completely ransacked the Spanish fort town of Badajoz, and in more normal circumstances his attitude was not so derogatory and was even quite endearing. It still holds true for the public attitude of armies at the time. See, soldiers were pretty widely hated, and in a way, it makes sense given the circumstances of the age. Soldiers were more often than not drawn from the bottom rungs of society. Drunkards and lowlifes with very little prospects were the norm, and while many did indeed join with delusions of an illustrious and glorious life, most joined for steady meals and a hefty supply of alcohol. And that truth is pretty unavoidable. On top of this, they were seen by many as tools of oppression. Armies were often posted to hotspots, areas of countries where the government had an, at best, strenuous grip on society. You have to remember that organised policing was definitely not a thing at this time. For the UK, a completely disproportionate number of barracks and also soldiers were in places like Ireland and Scotland, and they were called the rivets that held the nation together. Before the use of barracks, the problem was even worse. Soldiers would be billeted to inns and taverns where the government would set often deliriously low rates for the innkeepers to be paid to host the men, and they would often cause more than few issues for the locals. In fact, the entire reason the Third Amendment exists in the US Constitution is for this very reason. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Basically, soldiers had caused such an uproar being posted in private properties, this was seen as a very legitimate issue. The French had a famous story from the 17th century of badly behaved dragoons being purposefully billeted to Protestant households in order to harass them into completely leaving France or converting to Catholicism. Soldiers were certainly not endearing to the public. For the UK, the English Civil War had left a bit of a scar in this way. Soldiers had been shoved into homes, often of families on the other side, without compensation for the owners. In one instance, a small village of 28 homes had to house 450 soldiers. Of course, this was on top of the already existing regiments, eating their food and sleeping in their beds. This is all to say, soldiers of the age were seen as scum and nothing more, and we can't really blame the public for thinking this. A nuisance on the nation, and not even a necessary one. The British age of mercantilism had brought the Navy into the public spotlight, and if the Army were the badly behaved black sheep of the family, the Navy were the shining beacon of perfection. The Navy, being sailors, could hardly impose themselves on the public in the same way the Army did, and despite their makeup being literally identical in many ways to that of the Army, their continued effort in propping up the British economy abroad lent them a beautiful sheen of liberty. No Englishman could deny the romantic image of a swashbuckling sailor, or so-called Jack Tar, fighting for king and country and liberty for all. In fact, after the British naval mutinies that occurred in the late 18th century, Parliament had some things to say, and perhaps we would expect some condemnation of the mutinies, or maybe a suggestion to cut the Navy budget. Well, no. The mutinies were seen as justified, at least some of them. Good-natured sailors with a strict understanding of their own rights stood up against mistreatment, and Parliament rewarded them with an increased budget. But what this debate did hold, however, was suggestions the Army budget was in turn cut, even though they didn't do anything. The public, and by extension Parliament, had little care for an army whose more recent conflicts involved fighting in America and India. The American Revolution was another hit for the reputation of the army. For many, they had attempted to strangle the liberty of English men and women, because that's what the American Revolution was seen as, at least by more liberal politicians. British citizens, even considered English by many, were being put down for wanting nothing more than freedom. And in this, the army was thoroughly dragged through the mud. And do you know what didn't help? The French Revolutionary Wars. Suddenly a conscript army of ragtag and downright dangerously revolutionary Frenchmen swept through Europe, pillaging everything in their path. Perhaps armies like the Prussians, famous for their drill, were more respected. Well, not really. The Prussians had a dark reputation for kidnapping and conscripting foreigners into their ranks, something that was ironically pretty frowned upon, considering the Royal Navy did the exact same thing. In fact, one of the best French marshals of the Napoleonic Wars, a man named Augereau, had been forced to flee Prussia as a mere private in the Prussian army, so he could return to France to fight. Aside from their supreme misbehaviour, frankly horrendous public image, there was also the sad case that their lives were, well, miserable. And if it has sounded so far like I have a burning hatred for the military men of the 18th and early 19th centuries, that would be very incorrect. Because yes, oftentimes these men were criminals, often drunk, often poor, often hungry. And all the associated crimes that come with this were all committed. But can you really blame them? This is an army that would have you hung for stealing a chicken just to eat. An army that would expect its men to fight colonial wars for a nation that as of yet didn't even really care for its imperial image. There was no glory to be found anywhere. The same men who fought and died all across Europe to stop the French were the same men who would be cut loose at a moment's notice. That's why we have forgotten them. We remember the men who went over the top, dying at the hands of German fire at the Somme, but we do not remember the men who died in the freezing cold of Spain in winter, marching day and night just to lie down for some rest, never waking up. The soldiers' wives and children, who when they couldn't keep up were discarded at the back of a marching army. Here we can refer to the anecdote of one British soldier, an unnamed cavalryman, who in one charge cut down at least 7 Frenchmen. A story that now would be rewarded with too many medals and awards to count. But all that was written of him was how drunk he was, how he had drank too much gin before the battle. He had got so lost in his anxiety of the fight to come, he had clearly had little other recourse. Did he die because he was a valiant soldier, or because he was too drunk to understand or even cope with what lay ahead? Suddenly this story becomes saddening more than anything. And this is it. This is the army we are faced with, an army of ragtags, dregs of society, hated by themselves, hated by others, forced to fight for a cause that isn't entirely discernible, and who had a long history of conflict with the public themselves. The same army that was 40% Irish had a hand in putting down countless Irish rebellions. The same army that had countless Scottish regiments, famous for putting down Scottish rebellion. If I was there, I wouldn't have liked them either, and that's just how it is. And I don't make this video to argue that they should be worshipped or treated as heroes, because many weren't. I mean, we just said that. But this goes for the veterans of all wars since then. The same holds true. War is confusing. But perhaps every once in a while we can stop and think. We don't need to build monuments in every town, like has happened for the First and Second World Wars. But the soldiers of the past, they have nothing. The ex-officers of Wellington's army could be found in cities across Europe, drinking their sorrows away, dying forgotten in the streets of great cities, pawning their old swords and sabres for money just to simply survive. We don't remember them, because the people of the time wanted nothing more than to forget them. It was complicated, it was stupid, and it was easier to forget. So I think I'll leave you with this thought. Remembrance doesn't require any moral attribution. It's not good, it's not bad. Like I said, there were more than a few bad eggs in the armies of Napoleon's era. But the same army that put down domestic rebellions was also made of many men from those places. That 40% of Irish soldiery, they didn't exist because they had any real acclamation to the British Empire. They existed because they wanted food. They wanted a steady job that could pay them and let them survive, even if it was an incredibly dangerous existence. And this is hardly unique. All I can say is perhaps it's better to not forget. These men returned to cities and towns that hated them simply for what they were. A pittance sum for a missing limb, or nothing for a lifetime of traumatic existence from the horrors they experienced. They may have fought for a pretty grey cause, a cause that was sometimes downright evil, but also a cause that was sometimes pretty good. But they fought nonetheless. And maybe, if the governments of the time didn't want to forget everyone but the illustrious leaders of the conflicts, maybe we can try our hand at doing the opposite. And because of this, over the next year, I'll be running videos on the lives and stories of the soldiers of Wellington's army. Maybe do a little bit to help us understand what they really went through. And I can tell you this now, it's really not pretty. But anyways, if you enjoyed, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. I know this is more of an opinion piece than my usual content, but really do please forgive me. More typical stuff of mine is in the works, so stay tuned. And if you're in this in podcast format, please follow. But of course, only if you enjoyed. I will also have a Discord and Patreon link in my bio. See y'all next time.